It's the True Penny Show with your host, James True Penny.
Hello and welcome to the True Penny Show. My name's James True Penny. This is my show. Today we are looking at the life and times of David "Fit" Finlay, the Belfast Bruiser himself. And to join me is Mr. Marcus Green of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. How are we doing, sir?
Good. This is kind of us getting back to one of our playlists. James always does a great job putting these together. Lighter on the number this time. Thank you for that. But no less effective. Yeah, no less effective because of the individual we're talking about. And we've talked about a lot of guys who can be considered some of the toughest in the business, and I think you have to add one Fit Finlay to that long list.
Absolutely. Fit was born in Belfast, raised in the wrestling industry by his father, who was a pro and an amateur. His father was the All-Ireland amateur wrestling coach well into his career. A shooter, an amateur wrestler, and then turned pro in his teenage years. His first gimmick was a gladiator gimmick, which he hated because he was a babyface. And slightly grew out of that and was wrestling on the UK circuit by the time he was a teenager. He was one of a very select few serious Irish wrestlers that made it over to the UK because of the politics of the situation, especially from Belfast in the 70s and 80s. And he became one of the top draws exceptionally quickly in the British wrestling scene in the 1980s. And today, we're looking at 10 matches about Fit's European career, and the ones that are really important to me, and the ones where I really noticed him as a wrestling fan when I was in my youth many years ago. But also, I think probably the most important matches that kind of really put him... It showed off what he was capable of as he went from being a rookie to being essentially the top heel drawer in the UK. Now, Marcus, I have given you a task with these 10 matches because A, the wrestling style you have very rarely, if ever, watched, under a rule set you've probably never understood, and some of them are in Welsh. So, for a beginner looking at World of Sport British Wrestling for the first time, what was your first overall impressions of the first match, which was Chris Adams versus Fit Finlay?
I appreciate it because you can't be a fan of True Penny Show and not really be a fan of. It's almost cringe saying this a little bit just because of just how much hyperbole gets tossed around with the myriad of podcasts that are out now on wrestling. But you can't really call yourself a real fan of bad form wrestling if you not a fan of this style, because it really gets down to us. I believe it really gets showcases the nuts and bolts of this art form that we love.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really strips everything down. It's not the GMSMI to getting their stuff in type of deal. It's really chess. In other words, those situations where it's not it checkers its chess. You're really building to things that in the States really throwaway moves, stuff that you do in the first couple minutes to kind of just go through the rigmarole. You build to those things here. Like a sunset flip can mean everything in these type of matches.
Yeah.
The concept of really locking in putting your body rate in a lateral pin, maintaining body control and holding control of the arm, and it's all the nuances that matter in this style of like I said, the art form, and that's what made it explode everything down. Like I said, get down to the nuts and bolts, and the rounds just kind of made you pay attention more because everything, like I said, slowed down. You're not worrying about the next big move or this, that, and the third. You kind of can really just hone in on what's happening. You're not waiting for somebody to hit a signature and this, that, and the third. So it really, to me, really gets down to the real toughness of everything. You can't really call this stuff fake because I'm just watching him hit somebody like Johnny Say in the gut, and he drops like a stone, because this is like I said, it's the nuts and bolts of it. You can't run from this style of wrestling.
No, you absolutely can't. It's kind of typical of the time. This opening match is Chris Adams, gentleman Chris Adams as he was then, previously judo Chris Adams. He was back in the UK after his first run in Texas. So this is Chris Adams just around about the time of him becoming a big star with the Von Erichs and Gino Hernandez and Dynamic Duo, and he'd had a couple of tours of New Japan as well as a junior heavyweight. He'd been in one of Tiger Mask's kind of foes. He was a heel in New Japan, babyface in Dallas, and incredibly popular here. And this is Dave Finlay's first television performance, and it's kind of a classic match. If anything, we're in a 10-foot ring for a start, which is anyone who's this is probably about a 12-foot ring. It's one of the larger ones. The next match is in a dining ring. We'll explain that in a moment. It's World of Sport on a Saturday afternoon. This is one of the biggest audiences for TV wrestling ever. About 7 million people have watched this match, which when you consider that Raw usually runs at around 2 million people, and AEW on a Wednesday, as much as I love AEW, 750,000 people, this was literally 10 times bigger than what AEW was producing. Now, it was the UK in the 70s, or in the 80s, there was a shortage. This is my favourite fond of saying. There was only channels on television, so therefore, you had a limited audience. But you've still got to make it interesting enough for 7.5 million people to tune in every week. And World of Sports didn't really rely on the star system. Obviously, people like Chris Adams and the people you'll see on this, I picked the biggest names I could. But equally, what sold it was this was a sport, and this was realistic, and this was genuine, and it's presented as a sport, it's commentated on as a sport, and I think that's really interesting for you as an outsider to come and see this, because if you think about, like, Chris Adams has just come from Dallas, Fritz Von Erich, the Cotton Bowl, Texas Stadium, the Sportatorium on a Saturday night. That kind of wrestling is a million miles away from this, isn't it?
Yeah, because you're not you can really just sit, and that's I appreciate the most about it. You could just sit down and watch it. Like I said, it's like chess. You're not waiting on somebody to hit the 5 moves of doom or this, that, and the third. Or a lot of times you can find yourself over here, looking at a match, and you can kind of outthink it while it's happening, so you can't really sit and enjoy it because you're so used to seeing guys go through their rigmaroles, depending on who's in the ring. Particularly guys who come off or touted to be more experienced than they actually are, and then they're getting in there with somebody who's actually above them, and then the difference becomes obvious. But here it's like, Finlay may have his go-tos, like that European uppercut is his bread and butter, and maybe pulling the hair or going after the leg or something like that. But you can't get ahead of these guys as they're going. You just got to watch it, and sometimes one guy's the tough guy in one round, sometimes he's not in the next round. So you can really just sit there and enjoy it. Like you said, looking at the numbers, it's amazing like how, the numbers are down with just the sheer amount of wrestling that's available now. Like it's like it really kind of harkens back to that idea of less really being more. But again, again to your point, that was in a very specific time period where the sport was taken art form was taken for more as a sport and treated like that and appreciated in that realm, whereas the entertainment value of it now is a very for lack of a better phrase, a very whole experience over here.
Yes.
It's not always wrestling for you, it's wrestling at you sometimes for the most part. So it kind of takes you out of it, and you become, for instead of appreciating the commentary, you become a commentator while doing it, and it can ruin the fan experience. With this, like I said, it slowed things down, got to the nuts and bolts. The concept of catapulting somebody into the ropes, which you don't know how dangerous that is until you actually get into the ring and realize just how hard those ropes are. It can completely change the dynamic of a match, because that's not even something that happens over here unless you see a bigger guy do it, like whipping them into the ropes, whipping them into the corner. Like it's just not taken as seriously as it should be, and everything's taken seriously here. So, like I said, I appreciated that. And Pitt in this first match is looking like a young veteran, which is insane. But to your point, he already has the experience of his amateur background, this, that, and third. And he sounds like his family is a group of people you just really don't want to try that way anyway. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean he's 22 at this point. He's had like probably an 8-year career in the pro ring because he started when he was like 14 or 15 years old. Um, and he they basically wrestled all over Ireland. You know, his dad had a wrestling ring and an 800-watt light bulb, and you set up the wrestling ring, you put the light bulb in the middle of the room, and you put on the show, and that was 7 nights a week, and that's how he learned. You learned by wrestling all over Ireland, the north, the south, in the middle of the Troubles. They were one of the few entertainments that was kind of like not segregated with Catholic and Protestant, so therefore they were kind of free to go everywhere.
yeah,
And you can imagine wrestling in front of a very British crowd in Derry, compared to Londonderry, or compared to wrestling in Dublin, you're going to learn a lot, right? Because that's two entirely different cultures of Britishness and Irishness that he's trying to navigate, and you can understand why you'd want to be a heel in that situation because you get to control the pace when you're a heel, right? That's the draw of being a heel. You call the match, you lead, everything works from you. So when you are in those situations where you can control the crowd, which is really his major talent, is he learnt the hard way in some of the toughest crowds in Europe. And when he brings that to a TV show like this, it just amplifies how good he is at it. I was going to say, because you hit the nail on the head, I was going to say, I've never seen a more complete wrestler have a TV debut. Like, he's the
yeah,
full package. We haven't got the perm, we haven't got the mullet, we haven't got the full heeldom, but this is as good a rookie match as you will ever see anyone see on national television, ever, I think. Because he clearly knows what he's doing. He knows the job inside out. And just the way he presents himself and the way he's like, he's not really a full heel, he's a working heel.
yeah,
But he knows which buttons to press to make that crowd go mental for him.
exactly.
Yeah, and Chris Adams as well. Obviously, not hanging about. He's an exceptionally good wrestler, and I think it's intriguing as well. After the Japanese tour and a couple of American tours, he's probably the most American-styled wrestler of the British crew at the time. And he's another guy that doesn't really get caught in the conversation when it comes to great junior heavyweights of that era because he went heavyweight fairly early and he wrestled in Dallas. But he was a great junior heavyweight in the late 70s and the early 80s in the States. And I think that's intriguing here is he's kind of like at heavyweight at this particular point. And they trust Finlay with a heavyweight. Like, you're not going to show yourself up with this guy because you can do what you need to do to get the job done. I think that's really interesting as well. Like how much responsibility he gets given in this age as well. You know, we look at this match. This match was 5 8-minute rounds, and this was not highlights. It was 20 minutes of it. You know, there was a 4-round match, and we see everything. Well, that wasn't standard fare on British TV. You very rarely saw the whole match because, you know, if you're doing 5 8 minutes round, that's a 40 minutes match if it goes to 8 rounds. Or if it's 15 3-minute rounds for a championship, that's 45 minutes. You very rarely saw the whole thing, but here we see the whole package, and I think that's really something a bit different I really enjoy about this, watching this old stuff and seeing how he developed. Shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
So the next match on the playlist is 1982. Fitz' second match on television, and he's wrestling against Davey Boy Smith from Holborn in Lancashire. At this point, Davey Boy had been to Canada quite a few times. He was tagging with Dynamite occasionally, certainly tagging with Bret Hart a lot, and I think he'd been North American champion at this particular point. He'd won the big championship in Stampede, or he certainly won one of the lesser belts in Stampede. He's not the behemoth and muscle-bound wrestler we would know him as. He's still at heavy middleweight. This is an eliminator match for the heavy middleweight championship of Great Britain, which was then held by Alan Kilby, and it's Finlay versus Davey Boy Smith, or Young David as he was known then. And this is kind of what you expect British wrestling to be, because it's exceptionally technical to start with. It does break down into a lot of heavy strikes later on, but both of them wrestling a gentleman's match in the smallest ring in the world. This is an 8x8 ring. This is tiny. We're in Hemel Hempstead, wrestling capital of the world. And you've got what within the next 5 years would be two of the best wrestlers on earth. And here they are at 23 and 22 years old, already well traveled, putting a main event match together in Hemel Hempstead of all places. There's 7.5 million people watching it on television. What did you think of this? Because this is kind of like, this was top level draw for World of Sports at the time.
Well, this was great. It was cool to see, a young David Boy Smith. I've always said, like, even um, when he first seen him in WWE, and then obviously some time after that, once he left, he's always come off like a guy that had decades um, in the business ahead of where his actual station was in real time because of the amount of experience that he's had training and whatnot. Like it felt like he's been in the business for decades and decades.
Yeah.
Even when it's like, how old is this guy? And then, you realize just like he carries himself that way. When you look at his resume, it's like he really does have a deep plethora of experiences. He's gone all over. He's done faced the who's who in situations like this. This is some of the best stuff you'll see. And really has come off like an elder statesman even in his youth. So it was really cool seeing him in this form here. Like you can kind of almost seeing him like grow during the match.
Yeah.
Even somebody who was young Finlay at the time, like you said, based off his experience, it feels like he takes control at the time, like a veteran in the match, which he does feel like at times he does, because one round he just absolutely dominated, in particular. But yeah, this was really cool to see because you can kind of tell at times, it's nothing but fighting David, but it was times when he really had to fight out of certain things and gave as good as he got. So yeah, these was like you said, two of who would be the best to ever do it going at it young, like you said, smallest ring in the world, which credit to them and how good they are. You don't even really pay attention to it because you're focused on what's happening in the ring.
Yeah, that's
Like
the
what's they're
thing.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah, this was the element of the style, right? If you have a big ring, that's less seats you can fit in a building, and they're wrestling in town halls and leisure centres and working men's clubs. So the smaller the ring is, the more people you can fit in the building, right? So you have to wrestle a style that works that way. The smaller the ring is, the stiffer it's going to be. So you can't go with big bumps all the time because you will damage yourself very quickly. And most of these people that he's wrestling have got to go to work on Monday, so they're not after damaging each other, right? This is about as physical as it got on British wrestling in the TV era, elder bouts than this. And this is a kind of more of a straight wrestling match. And as we go through into the next couple of matches, we get a better of idea of like the bump merchant Finlay could be, and also how he was learning how to tell a story with minimal of effort. So when he put in the maximum effort, it really showed. And this is a really good example of this. This is such a slow burn match. Like, you've got lots of technical submission work for 3 rounds, 4 rounds, and then suddenly the heavy artillery comes down. Then they calm down, they apologize to each other, and they crack on again. And then you get to the final round, and they're delivering pile drivers and fireman carry drops, and the big heavy artillery is definitely there in it. And I think that's really interesting, is like they gave these guys room to go just enough, and it really gave an epic kind of feel to this match. And it was kind of the blueprint for a lot of Finlay matches, even though his antics would develop. What do you think about that, Marcus?
Yeah, it was cool to see because, like you said, he got, it really felt like, a journey through not only through the matches that he was having, but also through this playlist. Well, I always appreciate the way you put these things together because it also tells a story. We talk about the history of a person. You have to show those building blocks of who they would eventually become and why they became that way. So you know, just also that you can instantly tell the toughness is there, that his ability to lead, his ability to dictate pace with certain things. Obviously a certain respect level, but also his ability to kind of go off like a bomb at times, and do that. So yeah, it was just, and it's also like I said, it's so much that kind of gets thrown into a lot of times watching the wrestling over here. Just something refreshing about like the biggest move in the match being a big back body drop,
Yeah.
something like that, and you don't, you almost kind of throw that stuff away. But like you said, these guys got to go to work more and with this style. Like you have to be so good at what you do because you can't just be trying to do this stuff and doing it wrong. Because one,
Mm.
you're gonna come off looking dumb. Two, you could probably actually hurt you. I mean, obviously hurt them, but very much so. You kind of have to be, if you're trying to win, you have to be on point with the stuff. Because if you're grinding your elbow into somebody's throat, or this, that, and third, or bending their leg a certain way, all that stuff over an extended period of time, particularly 40 minutes, 8 rounds, um, with these sets, that could be just as damaging as falling off a table.
Oh
And
yeah.
falling off a cage through a table. That really had no build to it whatsoever. You just kind of needed to pop the crowd. So that's why I say like this stuff it really slows things down. It doesn't take away any of the effectiveness of what you get over here. It's just like I said, it gets to the nuance, the nooks and crannies. Simple, insecure, somebody putting a styles, whatever. I can't see too many of these guys having small feet upside your head and your ears ringing for the rest of the match. I'm like, that's insane. But again, like you said, um, this is the way you appreciate the style. And I actually kind of like the fact that they get breaks because looking at some of this stuff, I'd want a break too.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like we were saying about like the standard of wrestling was so high as well, and it was self-policed because people like Fit would not take kindly to being put in with someone who didn't know what they were doing and often took matters into their own hands. There was a match, there's a famous match Steve Regal said, you can find it. I can't remember who his opponent was, but Fit just he didn't beat him up, but he did kind of like just didn't give him a drink of water, just demolished him in a working style. He didn't hurt him, didn't
Yeah,
cause him any bother, just didn't do anything because why have you put me in here with this guy? And therefore that guy never worked on television again. So yeah, it was kind of self-policing. The standard had to be that high, just because yeah, they're off to work tomorrow. I don't want you hating me or my mates. We've got our job to do, and that's how. Because this is the thing, and this is the bit that is kind of annoying in one sense, in very many senses. Is 7.5 million people watch this match. These two earn probably about 500 quid each, which is a fair amount of money in today's money. I will do the inflation calculator whilst I'm talking. But there was no merch. There's no marketing to it. It's a wrestling show, right? We didn't even sell at this time. You weren't really selling uh, football jerseys. It was just like
yeah,
you'd get a scarf from your granny and she would knit it for you, right? So yeah, 500 quid for this match, which would be £2,000 in today's money, which is not bad for a night's work. Or
yeah,
how many £2,000 do you have, and you're going to maybe main event 3 of these shows a year,
yeah,
probably. Yeah,
yeah. And obviously, money goes longer. Back then, your money
mm.
works for you more back then, obviously.
Yeah.
But
You have 7%
was
interest rate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But was there any forms of what we would come to know as the form of wrestling merchandise in the day? Did they have any forms of meet and greets or something to that effect?
They did have. There was you could go by, you get your 8x10 glossy sign. That was probably about it. But there was fan clubs. It was all done through fan clubs. So there'd be a Mark Rocco fan club. There'd be a Chris Adams fan club. Merch would be sold that way. But it's not like there was merch stands. You bought your foam fingers and your t-shirt at the back of the hall. That didn't come along until the 1990s, and it was much more kind of like there was certain wrestlers if their fan clubs were particularly big, like Kendo Nagasaki was one of the big stars, and Big Daddy did. But generally speaking, it wasn't a mass effort because at this particular point there was 2 major wrestling promoters in the country. So you had All Star, who weren't on TV, and you had Joint, who were then consolidated and were being run by Max Crabtree. So essentially, it was a 2 or 3 person show in both companies, and they didn't have the time to kind of do the marketing that say WWE did. It was interesting when British wrestling came off TV. They were talking about a budget of like £10,000 to £20,000, I think, for every TV show they made on ITV, and then WWE would just sell them their TV taping from Madison Square Garden for $500 because they already made it. Then that was the difference, wasn't it? WWE had invested all of their money into cameras and being able to run a show for Wall It. They did their own stuff, whereas ITV needed to fill TVs, and they were willing to pay wrestling promotions to do it, and it was popular and it was cheap. But that was the difference, is the fact that, if you think about this, at the same time period, roughly, the British Bulldogs, Dynamite and Davey Boy would be receiving $20,000 a tour in All Japan Pro Wrestling with a $20,000 signing on fee. They could do as many tours as they want. That was each. So, you compare what Baba was paying them compared to what they would have got in the UK. There's no reason why they left, is there?
No.
And they had their day jobs in Stampede as well. So yeah, it was kind of like, it was a different world financially for the wrestlers. And they were some of the biggest stars in the world, but they didn't have the same kind of cachet as far as cultural dent. The big names did. Like 40 years after all this happened, I'm still talking about Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks with people, because that's who they bring up when they talk about wrestling. They don't talk about Fit Finlay, but he was just as big a star in my world, because he was the guy. I was young. I wanted to, I wanted to watch his matches because they were exciting and he was doing things, and he was the one of the top workers in the UK, and he was always against my favorite wrestler, which is Marty Jones, which we'll talk about in a moment. Would you like to move on to the next one, sir?
We shall.
You shall, indeed. A tag team affair. A tag team tournament. I can't remember where this one's from. This is the 1983 World of Sport Tag Team Tournament. This was a riot squad. This is the tag team between Skull Murphy and Fit Finlay, who were the top two mid-heavyweight heels in the UK at the time. And Fit was then the British Light Heavyweight Championship. And the story was that Marty Jones, who was the former Light Heavyweight Champion who'd gone up to Mid-Heavyweight, was there to present the belt to Dave Finlay, and he wouldn't do it because of Finlay's ungracious behaviour. So you can see there's a bit of a storyline going on here, which is unusual for World of Sport at the time. But Marty Jones was one of the most creative wrestlers of his particular time period. He too had a long international career. He once wrestled Perry Gallo in Mexico City in a hair versus hair match in front of 30,000 people. Tag with Hulk Hogan and Antonio Inoki in Tokyo, but never really wanted to be an international star. He was happy wrestling in the UK and always kept his job at Manchester Market. Now responsible as one of the key trainers in British wrestling, and has a hand in lots of people, including Gabe Kidd. Skull Murphy was the son of Bull Davis. He was an old school heel from the southeast of England. And Skull and Fit Finlay fit together perfectly. And they formed this tag team called the Riot Squad during this World of Sports Tag Team Tournament. And Marty Jones is tagging with Iron Fist Clive Myers, a genuine arm wrestling champion. And this is kind of, we're starting to see the birth of Fit Finlay as a fully fledged character. It's more about rule breaking, and it's more about trying to take advantage of things and not being such a sportsman, and about niggling the crowd and trying to create heat. And he's exceptional at it, because everything he does annoys you. And it's fantastic. And Skull Murphy is of the same ilk. These are 4 fantastic wrestlers, and you put them all together, and it's absolute fireworks. What do you think of this, Marcus? It's probably a little bit closer to what you're used to.
Yeah, and it was cool getting introduced to Clive Myers, and that tidbit about him being an arm wrestling champion, which is no small feat. But yeah, this was more akin to what was still like I said, with the rounds of it all, and sorry, cut out there, with the rounds of it all, and this is the style, like you said, it did feel like it was personal between your favorite Jones and Fit, which would obviously translate next into a potential singles. But that's what make tag team matches so fun. Particularly when it's guys that may have not traditionally been together. You can tell those interpersonal stories from a singles perspective and tie it into uh, multi-man type of deal. So, with this, it was just the same, like you said, the Jones and Fit and Skull were really good together. And I thought, Jones and Clive had their moments as well. But yeah, just I think all four guys, really, I could have watched the playlist with all four of these guys, but it was an interesting tag match.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of is the first kind of like not westernized, certainly Americanized kind of double team tag match I'd ever seen. As far as like heels doing it as a heat, there was the fabulous Royal Brothers who were the babyface tag team in the 1970s. The Beatles had their picture taken with the Royal Brothers. That's how famous they were. But this was kind of like the first version of this kind of style of wrestling, and just simple stuff like dropping Clive onto the top rope with the elbow smash as he comes in, and it was just simple heat getting stuff that worked really, really well. And also, it's kind of, in many ways, it's hard to run that style of tag match in a British ring because it's just so small. This is a 10-foot ring, I think. So there's a bit more space in it, but there's not a lot of room to get all the things done you want to get done to tell this story. And it's kind of hard to do because, Marty could only have to just stretch his arm out a bit further and it'd be all right. So it's interesting how they kind of told this story and put this match together. But it really, yeah, you're right. It builds towards the burgeoning feud between Marty Jones, the then heavy middleweight champion of the world, and Fit Finlay, the British light heavyweight champion, which builds to a match where Fit Finlay defeats Marty Jones for the mid heavyweight championship. And I watched those two wrestle in person during that feud in 1983 in Cleethorpes at Memorial Hall. I've told this story many times before.
Wow.
You've probably heard it before, and you've heard me sick of saying it, but it was still stands up as one of the best in person wrestling matches I ever saw. Because they were just rabid for Fit. They just hated his guts, and they loved Marty so much. Marty Jones in Cleethorpes Memorial Hall is as over as it gets. It's like the most over you've ever seen a wrestler. There was like riot levels for there. And then after the match, we went out into the car park, and there was Fit and Princess Paula trying to get into their red Cortina, and he just started hurling abuse at us as we were leaving because he's a heel's heel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or as Lance Storm, I told that story on Twitter once, and Lance Storm replied to it, and he said, "Yeah, that's just how Fit was back then."
Yeah, I mean, you can
Yeah,
obviously you can say he tempered off later, but it's still, you can still thinking about him in his days on his run on SmackDown. You can still see a bit of that grit and that um crotchetness, if you will, that
yes,
if one could have that he maintained as you should, because he still maintained a lot of that style. It was interesting here because seeing what he looked like in the earlier parts of the playlist and coming here is like a curly mullet with the stash. I'm like
yeah,
he could have been. I mean, and then obviously by this time he got his lady on his arm, so I can kind of like the Irish little heartthrob vibe here, with the
yeah.
mullet of it all. He could have did a calendar if he wanted to. Um, but yeah, it's just interesting because I had to really look at him. I'm like, okay, this is definitely Fit because of the green and everything, and all. But this is still him. Like I said, the bread and butter is those those European uppercuts. But
Oh yeah,
yeah, like this was just a great match, and I think one of my favorite moves. 'Cause I think you were just listing off some like throwing somebody into the ropes and catching them as they're coming to the other side while sweeping the leg.
yeah,
Like that's just you talking about an a-hole move. Like that's just beautiful.
yeah. It is. He's just such a jerk, and it works so well. So, Princess Paula was a female wrestler from the 1970s and 80s, a massive draw in Manchester because she was from Manchester. She is, funnily enough, not Native American. Sorry to spoil the news for you there, folks. She's from
Yeah.
Gorton. She just happened to have a good tan. And because British wrestling was never not racist. Anywho, or wrestling in general, let's be honest. Find a wrestling promoter that's not racist, send them to me. And yeah, but she was a fantastic draw. Funnily enough, complete babyface as a wrestler, but matched up with Finlay, her then husband. They were just perfect together, and they got so much heat. And they could telegraph it because, like, if Fit got pinned, then he wouldn't get a kiss between rounds. Or if he'd upset her with what he'd done, it was like, and there's another layer of the story.
Yeah,
And they were perfect for one another in that era when no one had really done anything like that. Like, managers were not a thing. That was a very kind of American idea. We
yeah,
have Peter Zakash is our referee, a cultural icon for his performance in Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels.
yeah.
As a Turkish's trainer in the boxing world. But it's Marty Jones on the top of his game, one of the defining junior heavyweights of his era, and one of the best baby faces of all time, going up against arguably the best heel in British wrestling in that time period. This crowd is at boiling point for this match. And it's the little stuff, like just when Marty gets a phone call back, he goes over to the ring announcer and is like, what's the point? If we go to a tie, I don't get another shot at the title. He's constantly they're referencing the championship all the time. It's a championship match. There is respect for the title and the way it's presented. It's just so well done. And the level of heat between Finlay and Jones is just epic, and it's so good.
Yeah,
And it's still one of my favorite matches ever.
yeah, and we get back to because I think that's an interesting point about the young lady and how much ground she potentially broke, not only as a manager, but I would imagine also as a female
Oh
uh,
yeah,
manager back then.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Women were allowed to wrestle for All Star, but they were not allowed to wrestle for joint promotions. Max Crabtree said, "Oh, allow women to wrestle when the British Boxing Board of Control allow women to box." He was long retired before the British Boxing Board of Control allowed women to box, and it wasn't. Yeah, All Star was the women's promotion, and they weren't allowed to do that on TV either. When they did finally get a TV contract, so you can see why she would want to be involved. But she was absolutely groundbreaking personality to have a woman involved in pro wrestling at this level was absolutely fantastic. Sorry to interrupt, though.
no, no, I'm glad you thank you for that because I kind of wanted to expound more on that because you also sent me obviously I guess the foundation of this style we're talking about is like the Mount Evans rules of it all. Uh,
Yes.
and thank you for sending me that because that was a great breakdown going into these matches. Um, and it was cool to see that eventually all this kind of evolved loosely into like the Heritage Cup, which I would come to watch frequently in NXT. But
Yeah.
this how things weren't always what you thought they would be in the UK, and then for something for multiple figureheads to kind of come together and be like, okay, if we cultivate it this way and make it palatable in this way, then we could get something started and kind of cultivate it in such a way that it becomes viable and marketable in that way and sustainable. Uh, so looking at this and talking about this groundbreaking for the women, it had to be because a lot of times over here, that can some names in the U.S. you can't even associate without the woman who was managing them,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
whoever the manager was. So that's a really cool element there. But these two, you could just tell very much kind of have a fight forever vibe between Mr. Jones and Mr. Finlay here. And you know, to me, the interesting part about the hair for me here because in his earlier matches on the playlist, very much had short hair, which played well into what he was doing because he would very much use the hair as like well some guys will maintain control of the arm if they're doing a series of clotheslines, something like that. He
Yeah.
keep control of the follicles. and very much have that play a part into what he was doing, which to your point also made him such a great heel because even if he was beating up his opponent, you know, constant grabbing of the half pissed anybody off. But that
Yeah, exactly.
oftentimes got his opponents fired up in such a way. So to see him with hair here and then not really play much, play as much into what his opponent would be doing is interesting because that would have been the first thing I would have did with as much hair as he had on his head right then. But yeah, this was interesting because another element to it too. We always talk about how the referee is like the silent partner in the match.
Yeah.
But they could very much be like the secondary adversary for somebody like Finlay, because Finlay's the bell rings. Finlay's trying to get like an extra headlock on top of the headlock, or the bell rings and he's going to get another shin kick in or something to that effect, while obviously ducking a DQ point, because that could very much play an element into it. Because you could obviously lose the match like that with these rules. So it's interesting watching this playlist and just seeing how well he skirts playing the heel. Um,
Yeah.
with this, so that's another thing.
Yeah, this is and in fact at the end of this match, Finlay loses the World Mid Heavyweight Championship on a disqualification to Marty Jones, and it wasn't considered like a squib finish. It was considered serious. It was so because it was so over. You didn't see disqualifications very often because for those of you who do not understand Mount Heaven's rules, you had two public warnings and a disqualification. So if you got for your first public warning, you were okay. Your second public warning, you were on thin ice. So when you get to your third public warning, it's a disqualification. So obviously the heels would stretch it as far as they possibly could and then not get disqualified. So it was very, very rare you saw a disqualification in a British wrestling ring, which meant it mattered in situations like this, right? So it does kind of protect Finlay a little bit. But equally, it's like, yeah, but it matters, and the fans absolutely don't care that he's won by disqualification so long as he wins. That's fine. And you're also starting to see kind of like more Finlay kind of signatures in this kind of match, like the big bumps over the top rope and the knee to the face, which is kind of a Finlay classic, which was a Jumbo Saruta move. That you must have seen that from there or figured that out from there. Yeah, it's intriguing as well, and it is like because you have best of 3 falls, finishers don't matter quite so much because there's no real finisher for either of these two except for Marty Jones's powerlock, which is an all-time finisher. For those of you not seen the powerlock was a reverse figure 4 leg lock, which was invented by Marty Jones. The only other person to use it I know of, because William Regal was one of Marty Jones's students when he was learning, Marty taught him how to use the powerlock, and though he never used it himself, he did teach Shawn Michaels how to use the powerlock. And Shawn Michaels used it as his submission finisher for a long time, which is just the way the wrestling world works.
Yeah, and I always appreciate the added information, history of the stuff, because it came off at first like a variation on a sharpshooter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I thought that at first I thought that's what he was going for. Then he flipped it, and I'm glad that ties into something with Regal, because to me, and this is just and some of the stuff he's had as a part of his move set on video games. He has some very unique submissions uh, that I really only seen him do in that regard. So
A lot of them come from Marty Jones and Fit Finlay because he trained with Jones most of the time. He told a story about Fit, which is hilarious. So back in the day, Big Daddy used to was the big draw, right? And Matt Crabtree, who was the promoter, would have to find him some big lads for him to beat up, right? That's kind of the idea. Like William Regal said, daddy fodder is what they called him, right? So they'd get some rugby players or somewhere from some big lads from a pub, and they'd train them up to be wrestlers. They'd get destroyed. They go about there. I got to wrestle Big Daddy. That's the kind of thing they were going for. Anyway, so they got these 2 rugby players into a training ring. So like they have a ring in a barn out in the middle of nowhere. And Fitz training these 2 guys. And Kid McCoy and Stephen Regal, as he was then, were there for their training session with Marty. Anyway, these lads were like twice the size of Fit. They're massive. And he said they're not for the wrestling game at all. So you can watch it and you can see they aren't coordinated and they're missing it. Anyway, he said this lad misses something for like the umpteenth time and then kind of like clatters into Finlay. And Finlay stands up, looks at him and just goes, "Get out now." And he said, "You've never seen a guy 20 stone, 6'3". It's like 220 pounds or 250 pounds, and he's 6'3", move so fast. And we never saw him again. He said all the way through, Matt Crabtree sat reading his paper, and you just go and a chuckle as he gets kicked out. And he said that was a regular occurrence because it's just like that's fit. It was like he would happily train you if you took the job seriously, and if you couldn't do it, you were done. So yeah, but that was kind of like that situation. And in real life, Marty Jones and Fit Finlay were good friends. There was an unofficial crew called the Riot Squad, and Finlay and Jones and Skull Murphy were part of it because they were kind of like the top guys in the company, or top guys in wrestling at the time. Shall we move on, sir?
We shall.
Next up is an interesting one. This is kind of like a long-term story, as long-term as you're going to get in British wrestling rings at the time. It's Fit Finlay. It's Max Crabtree as your ring announcer, and it is Danny Boy Collins, the then welterweight champion of Great Britain, going up against the heavy middleweight champion of Great Britain in Dave Fit Finlay. Finlay had dropped weight, apparently. He didn't look much slimmer than he normally does. And Danny, who only retired a couple of years ago, he was his 58th birthday the other day, is giving away a lot of weight, around about 20 pounds. And the story of this match is Danny shouldn't be in the ring with Fit because Fit's far too good and far too heavy for him to deal with. And essentially, it's kind of a squash match. And Ken Walton on commentary, as you've heard all the way through commentary, is stressing the fact that Danny Collins is not going to be able to live with Fit Finlay. And though Danny puts in a fine effort, he absolutely cannot live with Fit Finlay. So it's a bit of an odd one for a company that kind of like put together matches on a competitive level with the idea of things being, an even keel and never that far apart. So I thought this was really interesting from a match point of view. And it was just kind of intriguing. Danny Collins would go on to be a British heavy middleweight champion and wrestled all over the UK. Also wrestled in Japan as well. And yeah, so what did you think of this one?
I thought it was a good. It's funny because it's almost kind of what we always talk about, like match placement on certain cards and whatnot. I thought this on the playlist was good coming off of those previous four bouts because it's like you said, it's a very technically one-sided. Obviously that Danny Collins can go and this kid's proven to be tough and that, athletic and the whole nine. But at this stage in the game, Finley's so technically sound. Confidence has always been there. And he really just putting the guy through his paces. But not so much that you can't. We coined this phrase on here, it's like a successful loss type of
Yeah.
thing.
Mm.
But this is just it builds you because at this point, it's the guys like Marty Jones and others who really box with Finn. Fit. Because also it's like you got to be good to a certain point because it wasn't at this stage. It wasn't that he just wasn't getting a kiss if he lost rounds of matches. She kind of beat him up a little on the head. So I was sitting up there like, yeah, that which is also tells a great story with their on-screen relationship and what that looks like. So yeah, good stuff here. You need matches like this. Ever so often we kind of get away from that in the States where a guy gets to a certain point and then everything has to be a dream match or something serious where you kind of have to remind if you're gonna have a roster with certain divisions of weight classes or whatever, you kind of have to show like this guy's good, but he is not on the level of this guy. Everything don't need to be a 30-minute banger. Like
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
this guy is on this level. This guy's to have him in a world champion with this amount of experience. He should have the night off in the ring with this kid. And
Yep.
there's a way to show that without making it a complete squash, but still making it dominant. So
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. And of course, as Danny Boy Collins puts weights on and moves into that weight division, you have this in the back. Well, remember when,
yeah,
right? There's a story you've already got to be told there. I know it's an interesting one to use it. This is Dale Martin Promotions, so this was part of the joint wrestling efforts. The next one, though, is not. As we move into 1988, shall we move along, sir?
yes, we shall.
I think it was that way. It might have been 1986, actually. So the next matchup is something a bit special. This is Fit Finlay. You're then British heavy middleweight champion still at that particular point. I think it was 1987. Yeah. And he's going up against the former, I think the 9-time at this point, world lightweight champion, Johnny Saint. Johnny Saint has been a massive influence on American and Japanese wrestling over the years. He was still in his absolute prime at this particular point. I think he was probably in his late 30s, early 40s, and was a massive influence not just from a wrestling point of view, because he was the ultimate professional wrestling stylist, but also from a professional point of view, in the sense of he was a guy who, again, Stephen Regal said he was his roommate on the road, and he taught him, like, wear a smart suit for dinner, present the sport the best way you can, turn up on time, be polite, shake people's hands, all of the stuff, right, that makes you a respectable human being. Steve Regal learnt from Johnny Saint. Johnny Saint is like the ultimate professional wrestler. He can make a match with anyone. And he was very discerning with his opponents because he was a lightweight and he protected himself very much as a lightweight. He wouldn't go and do super heavyweight matches or tag with Big Daddy or do anything daft like that. He just wanted to have competitive, realistic wrestling matches to protect his legacy as world lightweight champion. And even when he wasn't the champion, he still thought like that, and he was still the biggest draw. Now, this one is actually for All Star Promotions, which was because Johnny Saint left Joint Promotions in around about 1980 and started working for All Star Promotions, which was run by Brian Dixon. All Star Promotions got a third of the television contract in 1986 when they renegotiated the contract. So Joint Promotions got 1/3 1 week, then All Star would get another week, and then WWF, as it was back then, would get another week. So it'd be on a 3-week rotation of the different companies. And as things opened up, Joint and All Star started swapping talent, more just booking each other's talent without really telling anyone. And so therefore things started to be a bit more across the board because you didn't see certain matches because people were tied up in certain companies. So this is very much a dream match of the era. You didn't see lightweight champions wrestling outside of their weight division, maybe welterweight or middleweight at most. But you have an experienced grafter taught by Billy Robinson in Johnny Saint, and you have an experienced grafter taught by David Finlay in David Finlay. So this was kind of a classic kind of matchup in a very different way and something we probably didn't think we'd ever see. But what did you think of this one, Marcus? Because this is a bit special.
Yeah, I thought it was another highly competitive thing, and I thought Johnny Saint, somebody that very matched up with him very well. And I just always know you kind of got to be mindful of any of these guys that really just step in a ring, particularly in this time, with this style against somebody like Fit, and all they got on is trunks and boots. Really just trunks and boots. I can imagine how that ring is and constructed and feels, and it shows a case of just a different level of toughness. And
Oh
usually,
yeah.
most times, I would imagine Fit's the toughest in the ring, but that wasn't the case here. And again, to your earlier points about watching him elevate, I always had the heel stuff, but showcasing that those vulnerable moments where he kind of had to back off or go outside for a second and recollect himself. When earlier he kind of just would barrel through,
Yeah.
really trying to really ignore the breaks, because a lot of those breaks came off like they was 10 seconds instead of 30 seconds the way he was moving, particularly against certain opponents. So here he was very much getting put through the pace at that point and having to take his own little breaks, which was really cool to see. So even to the point where the manager was getting involved in the match, like, okay, allowing him too much leniency, which she hadn't done too much beforehand. So
Yeah, we are also at peak mullet at this particular point. It
yeah,
is ringlet permed, cropped on top, and absolutely a party at the back. In fact, several parties at once going on at the back. This is sheer 80s delight in Fit Finlay. In the documentary, the Fit Finlays said, "I didn't think I had a mullet. I was just the first person to do that." So yeah, he was a style icon in his day, and you see him kind of like monster Johnny Saint because he's not going to out wrestle him because you're just not because he's Johnny
yeah.
Saint, and Johnny has been at this point. Johnny, we were talking about like 88. He started on television in the early 60s. He's on a 20-year career at the moment. At this particular point in his career, Johnny's still alive. And we also remember that if you remember the NXT UK show, he was the general manager of the NXT UK show as well. He's still involved in the wrestling. At one point, he had a 6-month run as a trainer in the Performance Center. He's been a massive influence on wrestling for people like Chris Hero and Claudio Castagnoli, and for Cabana and people like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because they love that style and they try to incorporate it into American wrestling. And Steven Regal obviously had a lot of time for him as well because he was a mentor of his. And so he's had an outweighted influence on the wrestling business, as far as a guy who was wrestling a very specific style that was only really popular for a very specific bit of British wrestling history. He
Yeah.
punched well above his weight. One of my favorite wrestling moments ever is King of Trios 2011, and it's Castagnoli, David Taylor, and Bryan Danielson against Skater and Mike Quackenbush and Johnny Saint. And it's the ECW arena has never been quieter because there's a massive pop between when Danielson gets in the ring and Johnny Saint gets in the ring, and everything goes quiet because there's like silence. We're watching this because this is going to be amazing, and it watching here in this particular context, which was more or less a workaday wrestling match, you can see why they're so good. You can see why Finlay gets so much heat and how he goes about getting his heat, right? And it's a lesson, even like of how to get heat between rounds in slow moments. He's never stops moving. He's always talking. There's always something he's doing to wind up the fans, wind up the referee, wind up his opponent. It's just masterful. And of course, Johnny Saint, who's like the ultimate antidote for that. He's kind of like the mouth, right? Because he can just wrestle his way out of trouble. They're such a perfect pairing. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this one, Marcus? Shall we move on?
Yeah, you pretty much covered it, John. But I am glad to get the history on Johnny Saint. Also, just the name of Johnny Saint just comes off like somebody important.
Yeah.
Which is glad to hear. So it's so it's just cool to hear obviously that influence, and we're gonna talk more about Fitz influence as we get towards the end of this playlist. But yeah, this was yeah, it's cool to see he had multiple opponents where he could kind of have that magic with. Obviously, I think he really created that chemistry with most of his opponents, but really guys like you said, Marty Jones and Saint. We can get to some others here. But yeah, that was just like you said, he couldn't out wrestle him, so he had to out tough.
Yeah, exactly.
Is a guy that's coming there wearing nothing but boots and trunks, which tells you a lot more than you probably need to know beforehand. So yeah.
We probably should do a Life and Times on Johnny Saint at some point. I think we should really.
Yeah.
There's probably enough matches to make it one episode. This one's going to be at least a twofer. We've got a bit of a way to go with it, to be honest with you. However, let us move to the dark times of 1988. And wrestling came off television in 1988. It would no longer be shown on ITV. However, Channel 4, or the Welsh arm of Channel 4, S4C, decided that they were going to take up the wrestling banner. And there was a strong wrestling company in Wales run by Orig Williams. He was a Welsh wrestler. Though, of course, he billed himself as Mexican because, of course, why wouldn't you? Like the guy with the thickest Welsh accent in the world billed himself as a Mexican wrestler. Anywho, Orig ran the show, what would become called Reslo. Now, if you listen to the Ogden Boys, they have their own podcast where they talk an awful lot about S4C wrestling. They do in-depth, like episode by episode podcasts. So that's well worth a listen if you want to go listen to the Claps and Slaps, I think it is, podcast. And this one is interesting because it's Eddie Hamill, the late Eddie Hamill, who wrestled as a character called Kung Fu. Now, Kung Fu was another Irish wrestler who had a big career in the 1970s. He also joined All Star in the early 1980s. He wrestled under a mask for the early part of his career, and then found out other people were also wrestling as Kung Fu, so he stopped wearing a mask. He had a mask versus mask match with Kendo Nagasaki and conveniently lost, so people could understand who he was, and therefore not have to worry about people impersonating him. Because, the wrestling business, what can you do? But he was a very good pro wrestler, and he wrestled barefoot, and he was originally a martial artist, and so adapted his judo style into his professional wrestling. So very little to do with Kung Fu. However, an exceptional professional wrestler. What did you think of this one, Marcus?
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, that was I was not expecting on the top of this playlist to get to somebody that he'd be boxing named Kung Fu, but it certainly changed the dynamics of the clash in styles, which was interesting because, like you said, um, at this point, Fit had very much become a master manipulator of joints and body parts, which was very much setting up his style to the point now he's biting you. Um, so you have to be very calculated. And even now we got, like I said, the manager's becoming more involved. Burley, obviously, she's physically imposing herself and matching if things aren't going away. And now she's actually interfering and tripping them up. So, things with Finlay kind of just elevated, even if, like you said, dark times, literally, because things wasn't just said on TV and whatnot. So, not a night off for him by any means, but it like I said, it created an interesting thing because somebody like Kung Fu just brought a completely different thing. He would disorient Finlay in a way, whereas obviously with Johnny Saint, like you said, he really had to go there with him.
Yeah, that's it. And it's interesting because Eddie Hamill's such a varied offense as well, kicks and enziguris and a different kind of style that you didn't really get in British wrestling rings at the time. This wasn't kind of like chain mat wrestling. He was also super tough and didn't mind taking a beating. So he said, I want to make it as look realistic as possible. He wrestled Mark Rocco a lot around this particular time. And him and Mark went after it. There's some matches that are a bit rough. He didn't care because it's like, we made it look real. That's the whole point. So wrestling Fit might have been a bit of a night off compared to wrestling Mark Rocco. But yeah, this is kind of like a really good example of the way the British wrestling industry was going. It was kind of a bit grittier, more realistic. It wasn't as smooth as the ITV presentation because they've got to create interest, right? So it's kind of the classic tale of any wrestling promotion. As soon as you kind of lose stature, you try and do some different things to try and make things stick. And it would become the blueprint of what British wrestling would become over the next 20 years. And I think as well, it was kind of like the start of people realizing we've got to make a living and we can't do it in the UK all the time. There's got to be other avenues for us to do, right? So,
yeah.
It's something Spud talked about as well an awful lot in his career, which was as much as he loved watching the old guys, as far as wrestling was concerned, was they all left and we had to do it ourselves. He said we, and that's no knock on the guys that got to make a living. He said, but we didn't have that generation of Marty Jones and Mark Rocco and Dave Finlay and to learn from because they'd either retired or they'd gone somewhere else. He said, so we had to figure it out for ourselves, and that's why there was such a disconnect between what was happening in the mid 90s and by the time what's happening in the early 2000s. It's only a 5 year period in that British wrestling ring, but it's like night and day compared to the wrestling styles that were going on and who was promoting and how things were working. It's a really interesting time period for British wrestling. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this match?
I'll get out here. You still on Kung Fu?
Yes.
Yeah, like I said, it's just like you said, because of the contrast in styles, he using more kicks, insecurities and stuff like that, which was kind of newer in terms of it contrasting with Fit. Usually somebody try to out tough him or to the point where it got to the point some opponents really was try to take the power game with him, which was also deceptively powerful. In that regard, very much utilizing the Samoan drop and power slams and what have you. But here, Kung Fu got crafty, tying him up in the ropes, which was newer for him and stuff of that nature. But Fit just had a way of if he was like I said getting disoriented, he just kind of pick you up and hit you with a power slam, and you kind of just be down for the 3 seconds that was needed for that to go his way. So yeah, like you said, no, that wasn't a squash, but I think Fit was the kind of the front runner the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let us move on then to Graz, Austria, the Catch Cup. We're in CWA territory. This is. I've taken you a long way from home today, Marcus.
Yeah, it's all part of the journey.
Yes, so our last match was entirely commentated in Welsh, and this one has no commentary at all, which was better for you. So this 1990, we're at the International Catch Cup in Graz, Austria. Catch Cup was always the big tournament for the year in the CWA. They ran one in Hamburg, I think. They won one in Graz, and they won one somewhere else as well in Germany. And basically, they would have a tent or they would have an arena, the set up a wrestling ring, and they would wrestle for around about a month. And there would be tournaments. There'd be grudge matches along the way, non-tournament matches. So it was kind of like the G1, and it's certainly a G1 level kind of match standard. And this is Steve Wright and Fit Finlay in that particular tournament. Now, Steve Wright was a British wrestler, as you probably guessed by his name, Steve Wright. He was another one of the Wigan mob. He was a snake pit guy, genuine badass shooter, friends with Marty Jones, was one of the people that taught Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid how to shoot fight, had a big influence on them, and had a big run in Stampede as well. But generally, he made Germany and Austria his home, as you will probably know by the fact that he's the father of Alex Wright from WCW, the famous dancing German wrestler. And Steve was an incredible worker, like an elite level worker as far as the British wrestling style was concerned. Generally wrestled as a babyface in Germany, actually wrestled as a German in the UK at one point as called Bull Brewer, I think. I can't remember the second name, but yeah, he was basically doing a German gimmick. He's obviously to feud with Marty Jones. So there was a lot going on with Steve Wright as far as his level of in demand was concerned. He was one of the veterans of the international circuit as well. There is a kind of like secondary circuit in pro wrestling that you don't really see that involve tents in France and wrestling in football stadiums in South Africa and doing all sorts of things in India. And it's kind of like a non-televised circuit that kind of existed in the 70s and 80s. It still exists. It's kind of like still there, and it pays really, really well. But you don't really tend to earn a lot of money tend to get famous from doing it. You tend to like earn a good living from doing it. And Stephen Wright was one of those guys. Like I said, he settled in Germany towards the end of it. But is Ken again, another Lancashire guy like Marty Jones, like Johnny Saint, kind of the ideal opponent for a guy who stifles everybody, right? Fit Finlay's job at this point and the way his career has developed is to stop everybody moving forward. A stifling wrestler is all about stopping your momentum and like interrupting things at every basis. And that's something that we've talked about, me and Christy have talked about with David Finlay the current New Japan star, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think this is probably the best example in this playlist of Fit just stopping somebody, just grinding him out and making it a fight because that's what he wants. He doesn't want a wrestling match if he can't beat somebody with his wrestling skills. He wants it to be a fight. But a guy like Steve Wright, that's not going to work because he can fight just as well because he has the same background as Fit does. And that's the interesting bit about this for the match for me. It's a match of two equals at this particular point. What do you think of this one, Marcus?
Oh, absolutely, saying that's my exact takeaway from him. Steve had the size. He had the. I mean, just looking at the little mini kick-ups he was doing early on, I'm like, oh, he's just big. He's athletic. Don't let the coloration of the pants fool you. Very much given. Had put Fit on the back foot a couple times. We had to take him a couple 10-second breaks on the outside. So this was really cool to see because there was certain individuals on the playlist that gave as good as they got, but eventually, Finlay kind of warm out. But here, like you said, Steve, right, tough as nails, got the size on him, and also delivered the power, but also the athleticism. So it was good seeing how Fit kind of just, it was like I might have how tough this guy. I might have to break him down. So start going to submissions and targeting spots here and there. Like you said, complete wrestling friendly, but it was interesting the way he dictated what he would do and how he would do it based off, elevation of his opponent. He was never predictable in that regard. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting crowd. It's a massive crowd as well. Like your CWA got massive crowds in Germany and in Austria because it was such a big. I mean, Otto Vance was the big star. We've done a Life and Times on Otto Vance. Me and John did one a few years ago. And you kind of like have to understand how popular Otto was, and everybody loved wrestling because of Otto, and Otto could book really, really well. We're in an ice hockey stadium there by the looks of it, and that's quite remarkable. They filled out like a 3,000 seater for this match, which is incredible. Shall we move on, sir? Sorry, Carol.
Yeah, and I was also looking at the size and said that was a healthy size ring as well. So
oh yeah, we're back. We're European size rings now.
yeah.
The EU mandated bigger rings. I don't think that's true, but it's certainly it's kind of European wrestling's kind of. I kind of think of it in the same way as like we look at Puerto Rican wrestling. Like Puerto Rican wrestling was kind of like lucha libre presentation, but with American style stories. Is always where I kind of look at it, and I see European wrestling as kind of like American style presentation, but with British stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you get the big ring. It's kind of more on. It's still three falls, but it's less round orientated or longer rounds. I think they're 10-minute rounds in Europe. So yeah, it's things go on a little bit longer. There's more space to do the matches. Just generally space in terms of like storytelling, but there's also space in terms of like the ring. The actual like the canvas you get. There's more space, so it makes it easier to make matches work. So yeah, and also it's still kind of like sports presentation, but it's a lot more entertainment based. You're gonna get dancing girls in European wrestling rings. You definitely are, wearing as few clothes as possible. So yeah, it's kind of a different kind of presentation, but it's kind of the same kind of philosophy. Shall we move on to the next one, sir?
Yeah. Speaking of different presentations.
Yes, we're back in Wales. And Orig Williams is opening the show. And it's Dave Finlay versus Doink the Clown. Yes, him. Actually, Doink the Clown. I think this was Matt Bourne. It's difficult to tell which Doink it was. Pretty sure it was Matt Bourne. Could have been Steve Kern. Probably Matt Bourne, I think. And this kind of like... I just threw this one in because I find it funny.
Yeah.
Like, how did this happen? It's one of those great wrestling mysteries. But it's kind of a fun watch. And Doink is kind of like he's kind of wrestling in a straight wrestling match style because it's Britain and he's got to wrestle in rounds and he's got to kind of do things properly. But it's quite clear he kind of like would rather not be doing this. So it's kind of an interesting way of putting a match together with a guy who's got all the athletic ability in the world, but not necessarily the will. And there's Fit, who can wrestle anybody and make them look amazing. So what do you think of this one, Marcus? Because this is a bit of an oddity.
Yeah, it was interesting because, like I said, going out of place, I'm like, wait a minute, is that Doink? I thought it was a mistake, but then,
No,
um,
actually him.
yeah, as a thing, because you again, it's the contrast in styles. What happens when you get somebody um as serious and as tough as Finlay, and you put them with a legitimate clown, or somebody portraying a legitimate clown, and it just created an interesting, like I said, contrast. Because Finlay took all his opponents seriously. He didn't take no nights off. Didn't take it easy, certainly. But against somebody like Doink, it put you on your heels in a different way. Now obviously, I think you want to completely come out the gate attacking somebody like Fit, but he is older at this point. Not old, but
Mm.
he came up with some interesting ways of getting off offense, which more so annoyed and upset Fit more than anything, which we had not gotten used to him. Instead of throwing a tantrum on the outside by any means, like I said earlier, matches he's powering through, might regroup outside a little bit, but him getting frustrated by an opponent who he really should kind of readily be, handling, is the interesting thing. Also, Doink is not small here. So
No.
so whoever he was not a diminutive individual. So that also created
Reading the notes, it was Steve Kern.
oh, gotcha. So yeah, that was that's about how it would go. Yeah.
It's like Fabulous Ones. Steve Kern from the Fabulous One. It's just like wrestling in Wales against Finlay. It's just bizarre. It's like, so you've gone from like wrestling in Memphis, team managed by Jim Cornette and tagging with Stan Lane, to wrestling in Pontypridd. It's just amazing how the wrestling business works in so many levels. There's not an
Yeah.
awful lot else to say about that one because it's not someone you know, and it's just kind of like, well, it happened, just bizarre. So let's move on to the last one in this segment. We're back in Europe. Orig Williams is now on commentary. This was Eurosport Wrestling. Eurosport was a big. It still exists actually. It's still going. It was a European sports network. And it ran New Japan Pro Wrestling for a while, and then it ran catch wrestling and wrestling from all over Europe as well. And this is the last of the European wrestling we'll see. We're going to do another Fit Finlay episode, but we'll concentrate more on his other excursions around the world. This is also the last time we'll probably see Princess Paula, because sadly they divorced in 1996 and she sadly passed away in 2013. So this one is Millie Zerno against Fit Finlay. I think we're in Graz still, or we might be in yeah. I think we're in Graz, Austria. Could be in Germany. It doesn't say anywhere, nor does Orig tell us. This is living proof that if you give a referee a whistle, he will use it, and he probably shouldn't. So I'd like him to be quiet. That would be nice. So they give referees whistles to like blow when people were doing things illegally, and it's like, why?
Stop. Yes, please.
Please shut up. That's horrible. Please stop that. But yeah, Millie Zerno, brilliantly. Orig Williams from Croatia in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was not like a happy place to be at that particular point. I would stop with like, he's from Croatia, that'll do. Whereas like, this is like there's not going to be happy things happening in Yugoslavia over the next couple of years during the commentary of this match. I'd have just stopped at Croatia. That would have been fine. Anyway, Millie Zerno was the top junior heavyweight babyface in CWA at the time. A fantastic wrestler. And I put this one on just because Millie Zerno does not get enough love, I find, in the world. And this was a fantastic match because it's kind of back to where we started with a pure wrestling babyface and Fit having a pure kind of straight up wrestling match for most of this particular wrestling match, and just going with the flow. There's all of the Finlay needle and there's all of the Finlay mouth and the threats, but at the end of the day, you watch him and he's still a fantastic wrestler, and he's wrestling someone like Millie Zerno who can really go, and you see everything that Fit does to make this match work at the highest level. This is just great wrestling, and it works exceptionally well. It's low risk, it's high output for low input, which is what great wrestling should be. And I thought this kind of like sums up where Fit is at this particular point in his career. We're about 1992, I think. So this kind of covers a 10-year period, and it gets you back more or less to where we started. So what did you think of this one, Marcus?
No, I dug it because this is my introduction to Mr. Male Zerno. He was
Hmm.
very much given as good as he got, and we saw that with some other, certainly with some other people in this card, even early on, with young David Finlay, he was very much elevating as he went along in that match. But here, very much monkey flip. You kick me, I kick you. You take me over with a headlock. I take you with an arm drag. This whole thing, like beautiful sequences to start out, and
Mm.
then it kind of just became a contest of toughness, as you do facing off with Fit Finlay. Uh, even to the point where he was returning the European uppercuts, which some people just didn't do because they was too busy hurting from him. So
Yeah.
very much it's appreciated that he very much returned every bit of the energy that Fit gave, which some people just couldn't do. Because you were too busy trying to just figure out a game plan to get the one to get this guy off you, but two to break him down at the same time. So this was, like you said, just a straight up and down great wrestling match between two people who were matched very well against each other.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to talk to you about this. I should have talked to you about it earlier. Me and Christy was discussing this the other day when we looked at Osaka New Beginnings.
Mm.
And I raised this point. A lot of fans did not get David Finlay and at the start of his New Japan heel run as leader of the War Dogs and Bullet Club. And it took a long people to come around to the fact he was actually a world-class wrestler. He's always been a world-class wrestler. He's played roles that perhaps didn't suit him in playing happy-go-lucky kind of Prince Devitt. No, that's not Prince Devitt. Prince Finley's character that he had when he first came in as a babyface after his dojo run. But he was always that good. And I wondered, and I'll posit this question to you. You've seen the evidence here. Now, we all love Fit Finlay and understand his importance in pro wrestling. But if Fit was starting his career in 2015 and you watch these 10 years of matches in New Japan, say, against people like Tanahashi and people like Okada and all of those baby faces you know very well, do you think he would be as well received in this era? Or would a stifling heel that is a proper heel and does the job properly and is all about getting heat and getting negative attention on himself, would it have worked in the modern era? And would we have the same kind, or would we have this? Would the general zeitgeist have the opinion of his son? If you see what I mean, I know it's a really difficult question to answer, but I'm wondering. I think it boils down to like this style works everywhere, but it takes you longer to appreciate it. But what do you think?
Yeah, it's one, like you said, it's a good question, but also it's as complex as it is, quality, because you're talking about eras, you're talking about like for as many people as watching wrestling now is also kind of the erosion of um the wrestling perspective, because so much of New Japan audience now is kind of like integrated American fans who
Mm.
still, while watching, and you're starting to get this because we're almost chronically online about just doing this. It's still like a willful ignorance even while watching something like New Japan,
Yeah,
because there's the constant thief, the robbing of the joy of it, because there's the need for comparison.
yeah,
And a lot of times, so many of the guys that they liked elsewhere went over there, so by proxy that they followed that kind of begrudgingly. Um, so I think with Fit, and it kind of reminds me to a point with Hangman, because Hangman's another one of those names where he's always been able to go, but it's just been times where I've just not cared to watch him.
yeah,
And I wonder how much of that had to do with, to your point about Dave, like the things he was involved in, the way he was coming off at the time. Um, Also, I wonder how much of it with Dave, because he came up in a weird period where there was a solid foundation of who we knew New Japan's faithful in terms of the in-ring guys to be, but he also
Yeah.
rose to this prominence of a heel when everything about the foundation changed.
Mm.
So none of the guys that like they you looking at it, and the only person that's really left is Tanahashi, and he's retired.
Yeah.
And so, I don't necessarily know how much of the audience that has an integrated piece of that ignorant American audience has really been able to reconcile, and it's been difficult for us to reconcile all the changes that's happened in New Japan. While
Mm.
somebody like Dave has been consistent in his performance, but his stations on the show of who he's been while in the because the messiness of Bullet Club alone can kind of derail somebody even if they're good. Like the destabilization of what the Bullet Club was, what it meant to New Japan, to what it evolved and then devolved into and then had to be remade, which is another thing like that the concept of Bullet Club completely changed as New Japan had to kind of redefine itself. So he kind of got caught in a lot of storms, but stayed consistent. So I don't know. I think I want to say, getting back to the basis of your question, like I want to say Dave would have just made it work.
Yeah.
Not Dave, Fit would have just made it work because it's fit. And sometimes you
Yeah.
just got to power through with what you good at, and wrestling, it just talks for him. But
Mm.
Dave, it's different because he just got caught up in so many of those weird storms. I wonder
Yeah.
if he would have left New Japan and came over to the States and did something different. If we having another conversation, but yeah, it's just difficult. I think the best thing he's done is, to your point, to staying consistent with the wrestling.
Yeah.
Um, because it's really all you can do when so many things are changing around you.
I think it's intriguing as to where he will go next. He has from his actions in the ring, but he's not said anything publicly. We think he's done with New Japan Pro Wrestling, though there are rumors that he was going to WWE, and that isn't quite as sure as people thought it was.
Yeah,
So we don't know, but I think you are right. I think if he'd had an excursion like Jay White had done, for instance, and came back as a refreshed body, he probably would have been perceived differently. But instead, he ended up being this babyface that didn't really fit for a lot of people, which I thought was a shame because I thought he was great at it. But it's just one of those things. And then he ends up being, in my opinion, the best leader of Bullet Club because he was a heel, and Bullet Club was supposed to be heels.
yeah,
Devitt, and I think Devitt and David Finlay were the two best leaders of Bullet Club because they were proper heels and they were supposed to be proper heels and they did the job as heels. That's no knock on AJ Styles, but AJ was just too good, right?
yeah,
AJ ends up
yeah,
being a babyface no matter where he is. Kenny was a heel for a while, but it was obviously not the end game for Kenny Omega, as we found out.
yeah.
Jay White was a proper heel, absolutely a proper heel.
Exactly. Exactly. But
Yeah,
like I said, there was points of dilution with the Bullet Club too. Because to your point, it was supposed to be a proper heel faction. Great for Devitt. Um, I still say to this day, like Adam Cole was the worst addition they ever made. To the Bullet Club, just because it just didn't fit. And then eventually you see him go back with the Kingdom. It's like, oh, this is exactly what it's supposed to be. But it did get to a point where it just felt like, instead of being like just proper heels, it was just like the cool people's club. Like I remember there was a time
yeah,
like in my high school where um there was this new fraternity that got started, and it went from a few people having like the fraternity jackets to a point where it was like everybody and their mama had one. And that's what it felt like. It got to a point, to the point where it was a turn off for me. I didn't want to do it anymore because I'm just like, oh, this is just everybody going around this. What's up, frat? What's up, frat? Like, no, I'm not. It's not. There's nothing special about it anymore. And to a point, it felt like at times that was the Bullet Club, even though so many changes happened. And
yeah.
with Dave, I wonder, it's also interesting too. It's interesting when you're a wrestler's kid, right? Like
Mm,
when you do that. And I'm pretty sure you guys have talked about that. Like for him, how much of that was um people putting a chip on his shoulder because of whose son he was
mm,
versus him having potentially one because of whose son he was, because that never, you know obviously he was Fit's son, but that never was like a thing. And I think a lot
No.
of that had to do with because he went to New Japan when it was still very much solidified, and obviously he had to work his way up in that. But that doesn't play. It doesn't play for him like say it plays for Charlotte, even though she stands on her own as well.
Yeah, I think this is the thing. Is like part of being Fit Finley's approach is because it's so individual, but it's not like Flair was a heel, but he was flamboyant and he was likable and he was relatable, right? Whereas Fit's not that kind of heel. He's just a horrible, horrible man.
Yeah,
And it's just like he's got a terrible personality and he's always angry. And I think that's part of the reason that makes him uh being Fit Finley's son isn't necessarily the easiest ride because it's not he's not a relatable babyface that everybody can get behind. Everyone loves Fit now. They
yeah.
hated him back then. And they were
Hmm.
supposed to hate him back then. And he was doing his job. There was a story of like when Tony St. Clair, one of his great rivals in Germany, retired, they had to persuade him to go for a drink with him because babyfaces weren't supposed to hang out with heels, and that was just wrong.
Yeah,
And he took the job exceptionally seriously, and he lived his gimmick, and that's I think as well. He was. It's not like let's say Charlotte. Yeah, Flair was like the guy, right? He was the ultimate wrestler. Whereas
yeah,
Fit didn't have that effect on the North American circuit, as we'll find out in our next play. But he was much more influential in backstage stuff and training wrestlers and getting people over. Um, Not to say that Rick didn't get people over, of course he did, but you know what I mean. It was like Rick Ric Flair is incredibly important to the business. So is Fit Finlay. The business doesn't run without somebody like Fit Finlay because it just can't. You need those guys.
yeah,
And I think that it's a hidden kind of importance that you don't get that legacy transfer that say like and it's also a visual representation as well, like a lot of Charlotte's gowns and stuff are Rick gave them to her and she had them adapted for her. There's a visual language of flairness, if that makes sense.
yeah. Absolutely,
Where
absolutely.
there's the visual language of being a Finley is cutting people off and grinding and sticking your forearm in the face when you pin them and all the niggling bits, which David Finlay used as leader of Bullet Club. Um, but it's kind of interesting that you're right. I think it's that lack of transfer is really interesting because
Yeah,
I don't think it's the same kind of
yeah,
shame.
yeah. And one more piece to your point is because I was thinking about it as you was talking. I wondered how much of the and maybe it's not even willful by the audience. Maybe it's just kind of unconsciously because so long Bullet Club had that cool factor to it. Getting back because I don't know how many people hopped on Bullet Club when it first started like properly with Finn leading it. I think a lot of people came in later as it
Yeah,
blew up when you got the Bucks in there and that whole
yeah,
thing, and they was constantly bringing it back and forth over into the states, and how that evolved that way. That Dave taking it back to a proper may have turned a lot of those fans off because they're so used to just feeling like, oh, this is the cool thing.
mm.
Taking it back to heel proper almost kind of feels like a revolt to them. And in
Yeah,
a time, particularly in the states, where it's like everybody's got to be the cool heel.
yeah,
What Gunther's recently been doing by being just a complete douche nozzle. Is oftentimes seen as going against the grain when it really is what you should be doing as a heel. And not
yeah,
everybody. You're not gonna be the dude that the men want to be and the women want to be with. No, you're just pissing everybody off, and that's something that sadly has become a bit of a lost art form within the art form, which I
yeah,
know a lot of guys complain about. So I wonder, will Fit getting back to a proper just you kind of get I guess you kind of gotta let time do its thing. Like I said, along with the reformation of everything that's new about New Japan.
yeah,
Like I said, you kind of just I guess you just gotta ride the waves. But that may end up benefiting him in the long run because we've seen with guys like my guy Goto and others who have lasted through the waves, will
yeah.
and been able to stand the test of time to kind of get the riches at the end.
Yeah.
of the thing, because it'll be easy for him to. It would have been easy for him, I think, to jump ship to come to the States to try to get some popularity if it wasn't working out in New Japan, but he didn't do that, and I think that's going to ultimately benefit him in the long run.
Yeah. We'll have to see where young David ends up. But that brings us to the end of our first chapter of the life and times of David Finlay. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Marcus, where can we find you on the internet, sir?
Oh yes, yes, rallying against the grain, hopefully with all the other good-minded people on the cesspool app. That is Twitter now X. You can find me at Paradox Kid. That's PARADOXKID.
You can find me at Sheriff Lenstar on Twitter and on Mastodon and on Blue Sky. You can also find the show Trooping Show on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram. We'll be back next week. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Go watch our playlist. Go and listen to us on SoundCloud. If you could like us on YouTube, if you're listening there, like and subscribe. That would be glorious. Helps us with the algorithm. We'd really like it a lot. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.